Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back. Brandon again. Today I'm going to be talking about the Rogue Monster Hip Thrust Bench, which surprisingly I've actually been using quite a lot. And I say surprisingly because even though I bought this with the intent to use it, that doesn't always play out that way with everything I buy. Take a look at the reverse hyper, for example. I still get a lot of hate on that video. But for the hip thrust, it's something that I've always wanted to add into my routine. Number one, following people like Brett Contreras, Matt Ogus, seeing their progress, and just knowing my own personal physique and training, I've noticed that my glutes seem to be a weak point overall, and I haven't really been able to hit them that well at home. Now, I say that as coming from a commercial gym where they have more specialized types of equipment, do a lot of different freaky things there where I felt it more in my glutes. At home, hasn't really been the same story. And to be honest, even though I have the basic equipment in order to do it, which is a standalone bench and a barbell, setting up for a hip thrust has always been something that has given me trouble.
Not really sure how to explain what's going to happen right here, but regardless, it's going to happen. Oh, this is awkward.
Now I say that fully knowing, again, I have the equipment available to me, but the equipment I have, even though it's very heavy duty, in fact, my bench weighs 130 pounds and I have more barbells than I care to count, setting up and getting secure has always been difficult for me. I think part of that is due to the bench's design. So even though it's very heavy, the fact that it's more of a tripod type design and I'm pressing laterally into it for a lot of the hip thrusts that I'm doing, it tends to rock and move around a little bit unless I brace it against a wall. But again, even if it's braced against the wall, that monopod front leg kind of gives me a little bit of trouble. And the bar and the normal size weights has always given me trouble. So it's not just the benching in general, but also just getting the barbell into position. So this hip thruster really helps here in that regard because it's secured to a rack, which is very heavy and not going anywhere. It's also adjustable on height to a degree, which I'll talk about in a second. But I found that it makes it much more easy to set up, especially considering I also got some of those 26er wagon wheels, which I've done a video review on, which I'll link in the description box below. Between those two, I found that I've actually been doing hip thrusters quite a lot, as well as some other exercises with this hip thrust bench, and I really like it overall. Now again, I'd be remiss to say you couldn't do this without it. You can go ahead and you do it yourself. I just found it makes it more likely that I have them in my routine, which for me is a win. Now, talking about the bench in general, as I mentioned, it's very sturdy. The way that it attaches is pretty simple. It has one connecting pin to the bottom cross member, and on the other side, you just use a detent pin to connect it and secure it. And then when you're done, you take out that pin and the thing just kind of flips and folds out. And the nice thing is it doesn't weigh that much. Typically, when you're talking about things to attach to a rack, they're either fairly secured and not movable, or they're too heavy where it's kind of a pain in the butt to move them back and forth. The fact that this bench weighs about 30 pounds and very quickly goes in and out is very nice. In fact, depending on where you actually mount it on your rack, if you want to do it internally or externally, you could potentially put it in a spot where you're never really going to run into issues using it. Now, for me personally, because I like to bench inside the rack too, I do have to move it on occasion. But again, it's light and easy to put on and take off where it's not that big of a deal. And again, I find myself hip thrusting at least once a week in the gym. Maybe more outside of the gym. I know you guys like those dirty jokes, so I have to get one in there at some point, or I'm gonna have someone comment about it. Now, as far as the actual construction of the pad itself goes, I think it's fairly good. It's pretty high quality. However, that's not to say it's perfect, for example. So the pad wraps around 3 of the 4 sides, which is nice, but the problem is the pad is only really secured on one end of it, the top end, and I just happen to find that anytime I pick up the pad to move it or take it off of the rack, I tend to grab the underside of the pad that's not connected. And even though I'm fairly certain that nothing's ever going to disconnect, it just doesn't feel right all the time. It feels like I might potentially be tearing the pad off. So I'm worried about the longevity, but knowing Rogue, knowing the quality of build that they have and the warranties they have behind it, if anything did happen, I'm sure that they would replace it. Now, the other issue I have with it is the detent pin itself. Even though it's nice, it's black like the actual frame of the pad and the bench. The problem is with the black zinc that they use on that actual pin, you'll find that it quickly scratches and actually starts to fade over time a little bit. So even though black zinc to me looks nice initially, it's one of the reasons why I don't get it on any of my barbells. I find that it tends to rub away and wear away, so it almost looks like a greenish color in some instances, to the point where some people actually have it rub off completely. So not a really big fan of that. I do like how it ties into everything else in the aesthetics of my rack, but long term, I can see that potentially being an issue. Otherwise, though, there's nothing really to talk about in build quality because, again, it's a fairly solid piece of material. There's no real moving parts outside of that pin, so you shouldn't really have any issues with it. Now, I did mention before that it's somewhat maneuverable in terms of rack height. And I say somewhat because you can't actually get it any lower than around 18 inches. So 18 inches is about the lowest you can get. And the issue with that is that the bottom posts where they mount together just get in the way. Now, I say that this is a potential problem because if you read anything by Brett Contreras, who I mentioned earlier, the glute guy who literally makes a living training people's asses, he says the ideal height for most people on hip thrusters is 16 inches, but usually somewhere between 13 to 19 is ideal. And I'm sure a lot of that is going to be based off your own leverages and things like your own height. So that being said, this hip thruster bench starts at 18, which is right at the upper end of what he suggests is good. So if you're a shorter individual, this might be too tall. And even though you could potentially adjust it even higher, for most people, anything above 18 inches is probably going to be too high for hip thrusters anyway. So that's a little bit of a shortcoming of this bench, an area that I think they could potentially try to improve upon, knowing that with the Monster series, at least, you have that 4-way hole spacing. So there could potentially be a workaround where you're able to mount the actual hip thrust pad a little bit lower if need be. But with that, it said, the actual hip thrust bench retails for $260. It's not cheap. And again, this isn't something that's going to be necessary for a lot of people. If you can do normal hip thrusts with a standalone bench and barbell as is, you probably don't need this piece of equipment. For me personally, even though I could do that, as I mentioned before, I didn't find myself doing them because it was just too much of a pain in the ass, and convenience is key for me. So paying $260 for something that I use at least once a week is going to be worth it in the long run for me. I say at least once a week because one of the other things that I've really found to be beneficial of using this hip pad is actually using it for split squats, which previously doing that, I'd have to use a bench and a barbell on my back. And the problem is I'd have to do that outside of a rack in most circumstances, where doing a unilateral movement like split squats for me is a little bit scary. I'm not the most coordinated guy, and I feel like I would fall over in some instances, or if I go too heavy where my legs start to get fatigued, I would worry about, again, swaying over from side to side or crashing forward. Because the hip thruster pad is mountable in the rack or outside the rack, I find myself mounting it in the rear of my rack and being able to do split squats very easily with a safety squat bar. So that's a really big key for it. Now, you could potentially mount it other places too, on the bottom cross member so it sticks up. Some people might think you can use these for box squats. I've seen that question come up. Personally, I don't think it would be ideal because of where it mounts and how high it is. True, you could probably mount it on the rear cross members, or the rear uprights, I should say, but it's so far deep in the rack, I would worry that you'd be very close to hitting the rear rack post. So again, I don't think that's necessarily ideal. But for me, using it as is for these two movements has been huge for me because, again, previously, even though I tried to do them, I just never ended up doing them in theory. There's also other things you can do with this that I haven't really got too into, like using band work with it inside the rack. That is an option. They show the pictures of it on the website. To be honest, haven't done any band work because my glute's so weak. I just do them right here outside the rack, and they seem to be working really well so far. I will probably eventually get there, but again, it's another added feature of having this inside the rack, being able to mount to your rack and use things like bands if you so choose. Probably a little bit tougher to do that if you're outside of the rack in a standalone bench, although you could wrap a band around the ends of the barbell and under your bum or on your feet, or you can get pretty creative. This is just a more efficient way to do it, in my opinion. Now, this isn't the only hip thruster bench or pad out there, as I mentioned. Again, Brett Contreras, who makes his living training your ass, he has a lot of different pieces of equipment that go towards this, including standalone benches and pieces of equipment, which can run up to like $500. He also has just normal pads that you put on the ground, which run just roughly about, I'd say, $180, which aren't secured, and you're probably gonna have to put those against the wall anyways. So I think at the end of the day, for $260 for me, to have a piece of equipment which will actually encourage me to use it in more than one way and really get my bang for my buck out of it, it's kind of a no-brainer. Again, I wish they would kind of improve the way the pad's attached. I don't think that's a deal breaker, but just something to be aware of. So if you have other questions on this or are thinking about it, I would definitely suggest it. But in the meantime, as always, thanks for watching and stay big.